Welcome to Colourful, a podcast where we explore how race shapes our experiences. I'm Stacy Jane, a white woman and mom of two living in Cape Town, looking to challenge the systems of privilege.
And I'm Sena Zungu, a black woman living in Johannesburg, passionate about interrogating power dynamics and the intersection of identities. Our vision? To spark candid and open dialogue for a more inclusive South Africa.
We're not afraid to have uncomfortable conversations because we believe that complacency perpetuates injustice.
Ultimately, we aim to bridge divides through empathy and understanding. Sometimes we laugh, sometimes we cry, but at least we're doing it together. Welcome to Colourful.
Right, so Sena, in our previous episode, we felt that it was important to address the fundamentals of racism by clarifying exactly what it is that we mean when we talk about racism. Basically, the definition of racism.
Yeah, that's right, Stacey. And further to that, we knew that we needed to address the issue of systemic racism because without understanding those power dynamics, we couldn't give justice to another important topic, which is in fact a product of racism.
Right. And that topic is white privilege. So look, Sena and I have been contemplating for a while how to approach this topic because it is naturally quite emotional. People can get very defensive. It's the type of emotion that is evoked when we bring up a topic that is quite hard-hitting. So we've spent a lot of time debating whether we're ready to hold this conversation about white privilege. And yet here we are today.
Yes, Stacey. So, as we were discussing all of this, as a black woman, the realities of white privilege are so glaringly obvious to me. I mean, so much so that when I've been asked to describe it, I'm so inarticulate. I almost wish I could point out to it like I could with the moon or the sun, and I could be like, it's right there. But that's the problem with white privilege. You often, to describe it, you have to point out not what's there, but you have to highlight what isn't. So today, we have a globally renowned futurist and the head of Tomorrow Today Futures Institute. He has 5 different degrees from 5 universities. He is the author of 6 best-selling books and is recognized as one of the world's leading futurists and leadership experts. He is a father and an ally who has been outspoken about race and privilege in South Africa. Of course, I'm speaking about Graham Codrington. Welcome, Graham.
Hi, Stacey. Hi, Sena. It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Graeme. And can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and what brings us here today in this interview?
Sure. Let me start the way that you two started. I am a white man. I'm born and bred in Johannesburg. I lived in London with my family for 5 years, a number of years ago. And I am an African by birth. I'm a 3rd generation on one side, 4th on another, but I'm also an African by choice. I have an option of having a British passport, and I have both, but I moved back to South Africa to be here and to raise my children on African soil. And my history is that I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in South Africa, went to high school in the 1980s in a segregated high school. And my high school was opposite Wits University. And so although I don't think I was really that conscientized during the 1980s, and we can talk about that a little bit of white privilege, is that you can protect yourself from what other people are experiencing. But the Wits University students, especially on a Friday afternoon, used to wake us up as young boys at Parktown Boys High as they sort of rampaged across the campus, and the police arrived to deal with it. And the bus that I took home was typically filled with Wits students, and many of them as black students trying to get onto the white buses. And I began to realize, well, hang on, not everything is as it appears. I was then conscripted into the Air Force, and then kind of had to come face to face with the reality that the system that I was part of was not, it had 2 faces, in fact, more than 2 faces. From there, it was just a slow process. I got married early in my 20s, and my wife and I just over a number of years just began to realize what was happening and began to feel more and more that it wasn't just a case of recognizing what was happening and then voting correctly in the 1990s to bring an end to apartheid. But we also felt that we needed to get involved in undoing some of the systems, or doing what we could to undo that. And yeah, I suppose there's nothing really special about my story. No major accomplishments around the issue of racism, no major moments that would stand out in history, but just maybe a typical story of a white South African who became aware of what had happened, what was happening, and what needs to be done, and just trying to contribute as I can. I'm married, still married to that same lovely woman, and we have 3 daughters, and I still live in Johannesburg.
Thanks, Graeme. I must say, you mentioned there that there's nothing special, but I must tell you that there is one special element of the story that you've just shared, which is what resonated with Sena and I, and why we invited you today. Is we mentioned earlier in the beginning that we've been looking for a way to bring up white privilege, and it's something that we've really struggled with, is to find someone who A, acknowledges it, and then B, can talk about it. So much so that we got to a stage where Sena thought, well, Stace, maybe I just have to interview you. So we're grateful to have you here, willing to share about white privilege. And perhaps that's the place where we want to start, is to say, this is the big question, right? So can you explain to our listeners what the term white privilege actually means?
Sure. So, I think we all understand what racism is when you see it in its naked form. Somebody calling somebody else a name or treating somebody really badly. And there's not that much of that left. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I think when people do it, especially if they do it in public, it's kind of called out. And in fact, people in South Africa can be taken to court for it. So there are consequences. But maybe what's left is what I call nice racism. And nice racism happens at 2 levels. It's either what is called in the technical terms microaggressions. And a simple example would be a comment about a black woman's hair that might seem like just a sidelong comment, but it's actually just so filled with all of that racial baggage that comes from the past. And white privilege doesn't have that baggage. So, you can comment about a white woman's hair and it doesn't have the same baggage. And white people don't realize that. So white privilege is seen in 2 ways. It's got to do with the privilege of not having a whole lot of historical baggage that is still with us. And it's recognizing the fact that because you are white, the systems of the world, and this is true everywhere, there are very few countries that have escaped this, but it means that you are assumed to be a good person, you are assumed to be a competent person, and you don't have to jump over as many barriers as a white person, as a black person might have to. So when you are buying a house, this is documented all over the world and in South Africa, that you are treated as a better quality of buyer if you are a white person than if you are a black person. And you're more likely, if there are 2 or 3 people who all put in offers, they're more likely to give the house to the white person, because it's assumed that you can get a bond, that you've got family and friends backing you, that you are more reliable as a person. And so what it's got to do with is the systems that are in place. Those systems might give you access to healthcare, access to education, might give you better job opportunities. They might give you better legal protections. They might give you better just social acceptance. And that is a privilege that white people don't necessarily recognize they have, because you as a white person can feel, but I've worked hard for everything that I've got. Nobody gave me any handouts. Nobody helped me. But what you might not recognize is that the entire system itself was geared in your favor. And I think that's what some people find difficult because, as I say, they don't feel that the system was geared in their favor as a white person. But of course, you don't have the other experience of realizing what it's like to be a black person in that same system.
If I may just make a comment there, and I think that the whole system, it's almost like omnipotent. It is everywhere, and I think in my experience, it is so obvious to me. And I think one of the frustrations that I have in engaging with discussions about white privilege is how often I even start to question my own sanity, because there is this plausible deniability, right? So you can speak about a Black woman's hair, and I know that it is loaded with microaggressions. I'm so hypersensitive to that. But then Stacey's response when I say, "Hey, Stacey, this may be harmful," could be, very much, "No, I didn't mean it like that." So I would also say, what makes it so difficult to recognize, especially if you've never, I get that you've never experienced it and you're not as hypersensitive, but even when approached with the discussion, what do you think is the main stumbling block that makes you not step back and kind of check your privilege?
Well, Sena, that's a good point. And I'm going to come in hot now. And I'm going to tell you that you could cut out this part later if it's a little bit too hot. But I think it's the right analogy. If you were to say to somebody, "Ooh, you're a bit of a pedophile, aren't you?" Or "You're a bit of a Nazi, aren't you?" We're recording visually here. If you're only listening to the audio, I can see that Stacy and Sena are like, "Wow, Graham." But that's the point, right? Nobody would want that accusation thrown at them. Your immediate instinct is deny, 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 because it's such a label that is meant to put you in a category of the most awful human beings that we could possibly imagine. And I think that's how people experience any accusation of racism. Nobody, well, let me not say nobody. Some people are racists and they want to be racists and they're happy being racist. But we're not talking about those people today. We're talking about people who don't want to be racists. They want to live in a world where, but I've got black friends, right? And I love my black friends. And, so they wouldn't think of themselves as racist. But then you've now touched on something, and you've touched on such a big nerve. And their only response to you is deny, 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 and then fight. Because they realize that you've really put a massive label onto them. Then they probably realize if they're really trying hard to not be a racist, they then realize, oh my word, now how long does this conversation have to be? Do we have to go all the way back to Jan van Riebeck right now? I really don't have the time. I'm halfway through my cappuccino and I really just want to get out of here this morning. So then they're like, no, I don't want to have like 12 generations of conversation now. And so they can then deflect and say, I didn't mean it. And that's, Sena, when you then experience, well, did I overreact in that point? And then the white people put it back onto you. And racism has hurt us all. We're all inside the system. And so black people at that point can then back off the conversation, double guess themselves, and some even become apologists for white people, and flip around. And then say, yeah, but there's no such thing as racism anymore. We've overcome it. And most people don't have the time or space to deal with it. They kind of get exhausted by it.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. And I think what would also be quite helpful in this kind of context is to give some other examples that you may have observed or experienced around white privilege.
I remember falling into this trap myself. And I don't come to this conversation as somebody who feels I've got this all right. I've written a book on it. Everybody must listen to me. And I have to constantly check myself. I had 25 years of programming to be a racist, and it's really difficult to unpick that. The best I can do is to put big warning signs up in my head when those racist thoughts come rushing to the front, and hopefully capture all of them before they leave my mouth or leave my feet. But a practical example, you're walking through a supermarket and you're looking for something on a shelf. So then I look around, is there somebody who can help me? Now, who do I assume are the shop assistants? And it's like the first random black person that is standing near me that looks like they're dressed in a vaguely uniform type of thing, my instinct might just be to turn to them and to say, where do they keep the tomato sauce in this place? Now, this person could easily be the CEO of a bank or an airline pilot or whatever. And I've literally just made an assumption that this person is a minimum wage worker who's there to help me in the store. So what is the default setting in your brain? And I have never been asked where the tomato sauce is or can I have a menu, please? Ever, not once. And yeah, it's not just white privilege. I have tall male privilege as well. These privileges all add up. Let me give you a positive example. My wife volunteers in a number of different spaces, one of which is at a school in a township. And this particular school in Alex Township, just outside of Joburg, they were having trouble. The plumbing wasn't working. The toilets weren't functioning well. It's a primary school, I think double the capacity that it's supposed to. So if your toilets go on the blink, I mean, you've got the school is in crisis. And the school was phoning the government department, and the government department says, you're on our list. We'll get you. The days went on, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It was becoming a massive crisis. And the headmaster just said to my wife, Jane, she said, please, will you just phone? Now, you think this is a space where white privilege wouldn't work because it's a black underprivileged township school phoning the Gauteng education department black person on the other side, and I'm using the racial label specifically to make a point. You would think that a white person has no space in this conversation. But my wife phones up, says, I'm phoning on behalf of Iputeng School. And by, I think, the same afternoon, the team had arrived to fix the toilets. That's probably an example, and that will maybe help us move towards saying, well, what should you do with your white privilege? Because in that sense, and there's a frustration in saying it because that's the system, right? If a previously white Model C schools phoned the Gauteng Education Department, do they get more of a response than a poor township school? Probably. And so that's a 30-year-old privilege that still exists for your suburban schools versus township schools. But then you add a white person's voice into that, and then suddenly you get action. That shouldn't be the case. But if it is the case, then white people who have that voice should use it for good.
Yeah, when your eyes are open to it, you see it everywhere. I recently went away for a weekend, and I went for a run on the different wine farms, and I just went straight in. I just ran on the wine farms, unannounced, uninvited. I just went in. And upon reflection, I was chatting to my partner about it, and we were talking about who would have been able to go on those wine farms. And we dissected it. So we said, well, if you're a white woman, would you? Because obviously your intersectionality there is both white and woman. So is it safe? It probably was safe for me because the workers on a farm are not going to be catcalling me and calling me out because that's the kind of behavior that they would be in trouble for. If it had been a white male that had gone running, he would have been welcomed with open arms. They would have thought he was a guest on the farm. If it had been a black man, there's no way he would have gone close to running into that farm unannounced. And if it were a black woman, she may be slightly more able to run in that farm, but the catcalling and the whatever, that would be her reality, So it's not safe in that sense. And so that for me, when you say, Graham, you start to see these things everywhere. I see them everywhere, and then I get frustrated because if I talk to people within white circles like I am through this podcast and obviously in my social interactions, sometimes it's met with complete shock. And other times it's just what I'm starting to see or experience or feel might be something along the lines of apathy, which is, but I don't really have to engage in this conversation. What I wanted to ask you then, Graeme, is to help me understand this response by white people, which is either to become defensive, and you've spoken that one through because nobody wants to be called a racist, but the other side of it, which presents as apathy, which is a kind of not engaging in this conversation.
Well, Stacey, that's literally white privilege. Your white privilege is that you can choose when to engage with this or not. So you can have a day off from being an activist. You can have a day off from engaging with racism because it's your choice. And I'm not saying you shouldn't choose, you'll make your own decisions with your own mental health and, do what you can. But I just want to point out, it is a privilege that you can choose to or not choose to engage it. Whereas if you're a Black person, it chooses you. And I remember a good friend of mine, NJ, he's a guy who I've learned so much from over the years. And he pointed this out to me. We were dealing with something that was an ongoing issue. He's a Black guy who also happens to be gay, so let's bring in that level of intersectionality as well. And he was just talking about some of the difficulties that he was experiencing. He's a township guy, and the complexities of his life. And I just expressed to him that it's exhausting. Like, I don't know how I can keep doing this. He was asking me to get involved in something, and I just said to him, I'm not sure I can. And he said to me, fair enough, Graham, fair enough. But please don't call yourself an activist if you give yourself a day off. So he wasn't being rude, he wasn't being unkind. He was just telling me to downgrade my view of myself. If I was prepared to take a day off, then he needed to understand that that was the type of friend I was, and that he wasn't going to be able to count on me when the going got really tough. That conversation changed my life because I made the decision that I would never take the day off. And that has now exhibited itself in a number of things. So, for example, when I put stuff out on social media, that's one of the ways in which I express my activism. I never let go of the conversation. So when somebody comes on and engages, either in good faith or bad faith, I always engage. And I engage again. I've just done it recently on issues around mislabeling of a boxer at the Olympics for being trans when she wasn't. She was just a woman. And I actually hunted down every single one of my friends, checked their feeds out. If any of them posted misinformation, I had a cut and paste comment that I put on with links to information. And a whole lot of them came back and said, Graham, you're a bit condescending about this and you're pushing, just, back off, okay. And I said, no, not backing off. Unless you either remove this post and apologize, I'm coming for you again. And I've had a few of them unfriend me, one or two of them block me, and one or two of them apologize, and one or two of them withdraw the post and put a really good reflection post on. And yeah, so do you lose friends? Do you lose family members? Does it give you sleepless nights? Does it dig into your mental health? Yeah, all of the above. For me, I'm not saying everybody else has to do that, but Stacy, this is an answer to your question. Why do people not want to engage? Because it's hard. And the privilege is that you can choose not to. And if we recognize white privilege, your next step is to decide how you want to deal with that. And you can either just say, well, I recognize it, but it is what it is. And then in my opinion, you're still part of the problem. You're a nice part of the problem, but still part of the problem. If you truly recognize white privilege, then you've got to use it and you've got to be against it.
Graeme, I love that example because I think it fits perfectly into what I'm trying to say next. To be able, I don't have the benefit to opt in and out of this. You can imagine how emotionally taxing it is. And you actually have to imagine how much you have to numb and how much you actively have to protect yourself so that you can get through your day. But I want to say, when engaging with issues of race in this country, I think, and globally, there is almost you need to approach this conversation very logically and devoid of emotion. And I want to illustrate that to do that is almost impossible when you are a marginalized person that has to deal with this every single day of your life. And it is literally a matter of life and death for some people. So I want to say, I want to ask, why is the question of tone or approach when talking or engaging about racism, why is that so important for white people? And is it really an approach thing? or can we now rest assured that no matter what way you approach it, it is never going to be comfortable?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know. I think you probably need to ask somebody who's not white for more help in that, because I can't put myself emotionally and psychologically into your position. But let me tell you what I do, which I think is useful. I don't know if this is the way Black people should approach it, but I think it might be a way that at least white people could. So for me, what I've decided to do in the way that I engage is to just ask clarifying questions. So when I see something which could be, and let me try and be charitable as I engage with the person, to say they might not have meant what I thought they said. Let's just say I might have misheard them. So that's the approach I take. It's maybe overly charitable, but I come in at least with that attitude. But the attitude is to say, I'm not sure I understood you. Let's say, Sena, somebody's commented, but Sena, your English is so good. I mean, you really do speak. What we really mean, Sena, is you don't speak English like a proper Black person. But anyway, that's what we're saying, right? I mean, we're questioning your identity. And now, if I hear that from another white person, I would want to try and jump in. So you're in a difficult position. Sena, I could, in fact, let me pause my story quickly. Can I bring you in there? Because let me ask you a question. I mean, isn't that exhausting when one of those old tropes come up? I mean, how do you feel in an environment like that?
You know what, Graham? There are points where I can anticipate it almost always. You always know what this
Sure.
is also another
You
part
see
of
it
being a
coming,
person
yeah.
of color. You're hyper vigilant. So you know the crowds in which you're going to. But there's also these moments where it completely catches you off guard. And I'll make an example by a recent visit I recently moved to a different area that I'm used to. So I looked for doctors in and around the area. And I specifically chose a woman doctor. So it was a white woman. And I walked into the practice and I told her what I need and what's going on with me. And she immediately says, "Did you study overseas?" And so, as a white
There it
woman
is.
who is a doctor, educated,
Yeah.
is in contact with a diverse group of people, that I was taken aback. So that left me sad, and I didn't quite know. And I actually berated myself for not having anticipated it, so I could come in with sort of, what do you mean? I think I
Yeah.
just laughed and said no.
Yeah, sure. So, and I can imagine just how exhausting that is. Maybe even more so when it takes you by surprise, right? So for me, if that happened in a public context and I became aware of it, as an ally, what I have decided to do is I want to jump in. So I don't want to wait. I don't want to sit back and say, "Ooh, Sena, this is spicy. Let me see what she's going to do now." No, why? Why would you do that? Why would you wait? I would probably just step up and say, "Sorry, I'm just interested. Why did you ask that?" Now, it's not quite as innocent a question as it sounds, because I want to out them, but I want them to out themselves. So this comes with humor. Somebody puts up a picture. Let's go really crazy. I mean, somebody puts up a picture of, a Black person portrayed as a monkey. Okay, and didn't they mean it like very racist, or is it just nice racist? I don't know. So let me ask them. I just see you've portrayed the Black person in this cartoon as a monkey. What does that mean to you? Or normally, if somebody's saying it as a joke, I would say, "I'm not sorry. I know you meant that as a joke." So I'm deflecting. Each time I start my thing with "I'm deflecting," like I'm not accusing you of anything, but I really just don't understand what's happened here. Can you explain it to me? That joke you just told, it seemed to be a joke because you laughed and a few other people did. The humor missed me. Please, can you explain the punchline? In a social environment, I'd try to just make it part of the conversation. But hopefully, first of all, the Black person there would immediately realize, whoa, here's a middle-aged white guy who's clearly an ally. So normally I can see all the black people at the table or in the conversation suddenly perk up. Now they're interested in the spice as well, but they become an ally in this. I mean, it's amazing how the dynamics change. It's almost like they go, "Oh, yes, great question. Let's see what happens next." And then if the person sort of stumbles, and you can see, oh, they've suddenly realized, then it's a wonderful teachable moment. Then you kind of roll your eyes one more time because you think, like, how many times? But at least you've realized you've now got an open door for a little bit of work with somebody that hopefully makes sense. If they've literally got no idea, you need to then open that door for them and see what happens. But almost always, Sena, I'm sure you can understand, they can't explain. Because as soon as you ask them to explain, their brain kicks into the second gear, which should have been there in the first place, and they realize, oh dear. And then it depends on their personality as to how they respond in that moment. They can either get very defensive on social media, they hit the caps lock key and off they go, or they block you straight away. After they swear at you and block you. Those are my favorite idiots. But on the other hand, they might also be just a little bit defensive, and then you can walk the conversation forward with them. Or they can be open to say, oh, yeah, I didn't realize, or I shouldn't have done that, apologize. So for me, you can then go wherever you want to go. But I have experienced 0 positive results with confrontation with these people as the first response. I'm not saying I wouldn't confront them. There are some people we get into nice fights about this stuff, but I don't start with that. I start with clarification.
When we met for coffee, you shared 1 or 2 of these similar ways of responding to racism, because Graeme, you and I, we have access to circles that people like Sena are not going to have access to. And we have a responsibility in those circles to ask those questions. But I was finding it very difficult to have conversations because I'm quite confrontational. And so I didn't know how to handle them. And I have had so much success in that gentle question asking. So I'm very grateful for that piece of advice that you gave us.
No, thanks. I hope it helps. And I'm not saying we mustn't fight. I'm not saying we mustn't push back. That's literally just the starting point, though. Don't start with that accusation. Never goes well, even if the accusation is correct. And don't start with the confrontation. Start by just allowing them to either get themselves out of the hole or dig themselves deeper, and then pile in if they're digging deeper.
Speaking of the spaces that Stacey's speaking of, there's certain, circles and people with backgrounds of either class and all of those things that she has access to. And she told me a story of going to a kind of gathering, and they were speaking about systemic racism, and the other person was like, yes, but like what system? Like, we live in a capitalistic world, like, the money, the bottom line. So we have an opportunity here. You are a futurist, and and an unlearner. You describe yourself as an unlearner. Why do you think that it's important for leaders in an agile world to understand and move towards understanding like the nuances of race and privilege? And how does this impact their ability to lead effectively in like the diverse environments?
Yeah, if you take this into a team environment, what you obviously wanting to do if you're a leader in that environment is get the most out of all of your people. So you're wanting to help them to feel that they are in a space which, if we use some of the buzzwords going around, has some psychological safety. And psychological safety at its heart is that you can be who you are here. So if you're a woman, we don't need you to think and act like a man in order to get ahead. And if you're a young person, you don't have to hide your lack of experience because we only listen to the old people around here. Or, if you come from the township, you don't have to pretend you've got more money and more history with money than somebody who was brought up at a private school in the suburbs. Just come and be yourself, contribute yourself. We value, we love, diversity, and we enjoy it. Again, another buzzword, another technical word, out of the area of white privilege and race theory is intersectionality, which means that what we see in the white privilege as it relates to racism, we need to see in male privilege as it relates to gender. We need to see in hetero privilege as it relates to LGBTQI spaces. We need to see it as able body privilege as it relates to disabilities, and et cetera, et cetera. So once you begin to see that white privilege or any privilege is not just about the presence of perks and benefits. It's not just about what you've been given, because people will argue, well, I wasn't given anything. I had to fight my way up. I had to work hard. But it's also about the absence of obstacles and barriers. So it's about the fact that, yeah, you might have had to work hard, but there were a whole lot of obstacles and barriers you didn't have to overcome. And so a good leader would help people overcome those obstacles and barriers or remove them in the first place. So as my good friend and colleague Buhle Dlamini said when he was on your podcast a while ago, he talked about the fact that it's not just about inviting people to the party. It's about letting them bring their own music and then allowing them to be the DJ. And I just love the way that he's phrased that. It makes a lot of sense for me. And that's the same as white privilege. So I own the house. I own the club. It's my speakers. It's my turntable. But you can bring your music. And what I want to do is I don't just want to allow you, when I feel comfortable with it, to play one of your songs. I want to open the door for you and say, come, teach me to love your music. Show me how your music feels. Let me understand it. Show me the dance steps. And if that analogy is a little bit too philosophical, as a leader of a team, what you need to be doing is realizing that there are people in your team who've got wonderful insights to say, but they won't say them because there's all this passive microaggressions come back at them, or they are assumed to be incompetent. You've got to have their back. You've got to set them up for success, and you've got to give them a space to shine. And that's what white privilege for me is. And I can tell you that there is no greater joy, no greater sense of fulfillment in my life than realizing I was a small part of removing one or two obstacles that was all a talented person needed to make their breakthrough. They were going to do it on their own. I'm not a white savior now. That's the other side of this. I'm not the one who made it for them. But there was a little obstacle here and a little barrier there that they could have overcome in the end on their own. But I just made it a little bit easier for them. And that made all the difference, not just to what they achieved, but the joy they were able to experience as they were achieving it, so that it didn't always feel exhausting all of the time.
Thank you, Graeme. It was so wonderful to have you on the show today. Before we go, you mentioned these social platforms that curious people would like to engage with. So do you want to share the links with us here?
Yeah, sure.
Where can we follow you?
Everywhere on all the platforms. Don't tell my daughters I'm even on TikTok. I'm sure they'll be embarrassed. But if you just search for my name, it is nice to have a name that isn't shared by too many other people. So Graham Codrington, I'm sure in the show notes you can get the spelling. GrahamCodrington.com will get you to my website and links to all my socials from there, or search on any of the platforms. And if you find me, you won't miss me. Because they do different things. LinkedIn, if you want to get more of the leadership business type stuff. Facebook, if you want to get a little bit more of my personal stuff, which includes a whole lot of whining about the Protea cricket team when they play so badly. And Instagram, if you want a very weird mix of memes that I like to share.
Amazing. Thank you, Graeme. Guys, I hope you have enjoyed listening today. I hope that we've together found ways to move us in the direction of actual integration, as opposed to, the kind of diversity tick box exercise that Graeme mentioned, that Buhle referenced in a previous episode. So we hope we've given you some of those kinds of tools. And if you have enjoyed listening to the episode, if you enjoy the podcast, we've had amazing feedback from all of you. So thank you for your engagement. Please continue to engage. We are on Instagram. We are on TikTok. We're trying to build our Instagram and TikTok. So please help us, share with your friends. And of course, subscribe to the actual podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and what am I missing? YouTube. So till next time. Thanks, guys.